It was one of those evenings when Oxford seemed determined to wrap itself in damp silence, as if the very stones had grown weary of conversation. I found myself, not for the first time, nursing a glass of whiskey in the corner of a pub that pretended to prefer obscurity. The kind of place where the curtains hung too low, where the paint had forgotten its color, and where the regulars cultivated anonymity with the same diligence that others devote to gardening or hymn practice. A man was singing at the far end, a folk song whose melody was older than memory, though the voice was hesitant, as if embarrassed by its own persistence. I've never been fond of such ballads, too sentimental by half, but I listened all the same. The refrain had the weary cadence of a confession, and I could not help noticing how each line seemed to end in regret. I wondered, not for the first time, whether all songs worth remembering were, in their essence, apologies. The air was tinged with smoke and the faintest sourness of spilt ale. I turned the glass in my hand, watching the thin amber light waver. A crossword puzzle lay abandoned on the next table, the paper stained with beer rings, the letters sprawled like forgotten bones. I glanced at it with idle curiosity. Someone had filled in most of the grid but left one corner incomplete. A 7-letter clue, parting words. They had written farewell and, upon reflection, crossed it out. The square lay empty, waiting. Such little failures interest me more than triumphs. A scrap of paper clung to my shoe as I shifted. I bent to remove it and saw that it bore a line of poetry. Misquoted, naturally. Houseman again. People rarely get him right. They prefer to soften his bitterness into something almost romantic, whereas he himself knew better than most that life curdles more often than it ripens. I put the slip on the table, flattened it beneath my palm, and wondered who had felt the need to distort him. The singer, emboldened by polite clapping, announced that this would be his last offering of the night. The landlord muttered something inaudible, perhaps impatient for silence, and so the man began his last pub song. It told of betrayal beside a riverbank, of a lover who did not come home, of a drowning that no priest could absolve. The verses wove their way through the room like threads of smoke, attaching themselves to the walls, the glasses, the very silence between us. I cannot say I enjoyed it, but it lingered. Lewis would have laughed at me, had he been there, for ascribing any significance to a ballad sung badly in a half-empty pub. But I have learned that meaning is rarely where we expect it. It slips in sideways, through the lyric that is slightly altered, through the casual phrase that does not quite fit. One must learn to distrust the almost right. Rain pressed at the windows, streaking the glass with fine threads of water. I thought, foolishly perhaps, of how Oxford's spires must look in such weather, as if they were dissolving into mist, their outlines smudged like words erased from a page. The city has always been more eloquent in the rain. A woman near the fire laughed too loudly, the sound breaking against the song. She placed her hand on her companion's wrist and then withdrew it, as though the gesture had been miscalculated. I caught the glance that passed between them and filed it away in that weary cabinet of my mind, where such moments are stored. They are often of little consequence, but occasionally, years later, one reaches into the drawer and finds that it contains the key to a death. When the final verse dwindled into silence, the singer bowed his head, embarrassed by applause that was more dutiful than genuine. He set down the guitar, accepted a pint with a half-smile, and vanished into the corner as if he had never existed. The song, however, remained. I could hear it still, even as I paid my bill, even as I stepped into the Oxford night and let the drizzle cling to my coat. The crossword clue stayed with me, too. Parting words. 7 letters. Not farewell. Not goodbye. Something more permanent. More honest. It would not come to me then, though I worried at it with the same restless persistence I have squandered on 1,000 unsolved puzzles of both the grid and the flesh. That night, walking back through the rain-darkened streets, I had no sense that death was already waiting. No suspicion that the song would return to me with all the inevitability of a refrain. I had only the faint echo of words misremembered, a crossword unfinished, and the old ache that nothing in Oxford ever ends cleanly. The following morning had the reluctant quality of a Monday that refuses to admit its own existence. The rain had not quite stopped, but the pavements bore its memory in patches of water that reflected the sullen sky. I was at my desk, nursing an indifferent cup of tea, when Lewis appeared with the sort of expression he reserves for information he suspects I will find both tedious and irresistible. He placed a newspaper on the table, folded so that a small column on the inner page faced upward. His finger tapped twice, as though emphasizing something he would rather not say aloud. "Drowned in the Cherwell," it read. Dr. Alan Tregarron, lecturer in history, aged 56, cause uncertain. Lewis shifted his weight, clearing his throat. "They're calling it an accident, sir. Slipped after one too many at the Kingfisher Arms. That's the story, at least." I muttered something about the pliability of stories and asked him to leave the paper. He did so, lingering a moment in case I betrayed enthusiasm, but I merely stared at the photograph that accompanied the notice, a man with the prematurely aged face of someone who had devoted his life to footnotes, his mouth set in that faintly disappointed curve which the academic world seems to confer upon its children. Later that morning, I visited the office we called an incident room, though it rarely deserved so emphatic a title. The folder prepared by the uniformed constable was slim, perfunctory. Witness statement from the landlord. Last seen alive at 9:30, drinking a solitary pint. He left alone, walking towards the river. A wallet was retrieved from the bank. No sign of violence. A verdict of misadventure is likely. Yet a scrap of evidence had been tucked inside, as if by accident. A note found among Tregarron's papers. 3 lines of verse, unfinished, written in a hand, both hurried and uncertain. The rhythm faltered, the rhyme imperfect. As I read, something jarred. A poet trying too hard, or perhaps a quotation altered beyond recognition. The words whispered of partings, of betrayal, and again of water. I folded the slip carefully and placed it in my pocket, as though concealing it from the mundanity of officialdom. Lewis, noticing the gesture, asked if I thought it meant anything. I told him, with some irritation, that everything meant something. The question was only whether it meant what we imagined. He smiled at this, a smile that carried both patience and exasperation, and reminded me of the previous night's pub singer, though I kept that thought to myself. In the afternoon, I walked to the river bank where Tregarron had been found. The Cherwell moved slowly, with the weary reluctance of autumn water. Leaves collected along the edges, brown and sodden, like letters no one would read. A narrow footpath ran beside it, muddy with the passage of boots. I paused, listening. The air had a silence that seemed too deliberate, as though rehearsed. One detail disturbed me more than I could easily articulate. The soil near the bank was marked, not with the erratic slide of a drunken fall, but with a pair of impressions spaced evenly apart, as though someone had stood there deliberately. Not stumbling, not collapsing, waiting. I lit a cigarette and considered the possibility. A passer-by, a young man with a dog, paused long enough to mention he had seen Tregarron the night before. Standing, yes, by the water. But not alone, he thought. A woman, perhaps. He could not be sure. The rain blurred everything. He tugged at the dog's lead and left me with the faint trace of a new suspicion. I returned to my rooms as dusk settled, carrying with me the newspaper, the fragment of verse, and the image of a solitary man by the water's edge. Yet I could not rid myself of the conviction that he had not been solitary after all. Death, in my experience, is rarely content to arrive without witnesses, however silent. That evening I unfolded the crossword from the pub, still damp around the edges, and stared again at the empty space where parting words had been abandoned. 7 letters still unsolved. I thought of Tregarron's own unfinished lines, of the song about drowning, of the silent figure by the cherwell. Somewhere in the failure of those words lay the beginning of a truth I had not yet earned, the right to articulate. The Kingfisher Arms had never pretended to refinement. Its timbered walls leaned as though weary of centuries, and the smell within was that particular blend of beer, damp coats, and extinguished fires one finds only in English pubs too content with their own imperfection to change. I arrived with Lewis in the late afternoon, when the place was still drowsy and the light from the river filtered through stained glass, painted the tables with wavering green. The landlord emerged from behind the bar, wiping his hands on a cloth that had itself grown thirsty. He had the cautious expression of a man long practiced in remembering selectively. Lewis asked the first questions, his voice polite, but the answers were already worn smooth with repetition. Yes, Dr. Tregarron had been here. Yes, he drank alone, though not unhappily. Yes, he left a little before 10, walking towards the towpath. And no, of course, he hadn't seen anyone follow him. I watched the man closely. He avoided my gaze with the deftness of habit. There was something too rehearsed in his denial, like a schoolboy reciting lines half-believed. I asked if Tregarron had spoken with anyone that evening. A pause, the briefest shift of eyes towards the hearth, and then a careful "oh." That pause was more eloquent than his answer. The barmaid, summoned reluctantly from polishing glasses, was less composed. She said she remembered Tregarron talking to a woman in the corner by the window, though she could not recall what was said. It had not been loud, only tense, as if the words mattered more than the tone. When pressed, she added that the woman had been younger, perhaps in her 30s, with hair that caught the lamplight. She looked uncomfortable admitting this, and I did not press further. I let Lewis pursue the matter, while my own attention drifted to the curiosities on the wall. Faded photographs of drinking societies, their faces blurred by smoke and decades. Old tankards engraved with Latin mottos, some of them incorrect. I traced one with my finger. Tempus fugit rendered as tempus fugat. A small error, perhaps unnoticed by most, but to me it carried a faint echo of the slip in Tregarron's verse and of the misquoted Houseman line I'd found the night before. People reveal themselves in what they misremember. Truth hides less in accuracy than in distortion. Near the bar rested a battered songbook, its leather cracked, its spine long broken. I leafed through idly while Lewis persisted with questions. The pages were crowded with verses, some anonymous, some attributed to poets who had never stooped to such ditties. And there, half smudged with age, was the song I had heard the night before. Its final stanza mentioned betrayal by the river, though in a phrasing slightly different from the version sung. I noted the difference, closing the book with unnecessary care. The landlord, observing me, muttered something about students and their traditions, as though that excused the errors. His eyes darted again to the hearth, where a scorched mark suggested paper had recently burned. He noticed my glance and hastened to pour a pint for no one in particular. Outside, the rain had begun again, mist rising from the cobblestones like unspoken words. Lewis remarked that the place was hardly promising. I told him that promise rarely announces itself with trumpets. One must listen for the off note, the verse that doesn't quite rhyme. He nodded, half accustomed to my evasions, and suggested we return in daylight to question the regulars. As we left, I glanced back through the window. The landlord leaned close to the barmaid, whispering something. She looked toward us, then quickly away. A conversation too deliberate, too late. Walking back along the towpath, I could still hear the cadence of the song in my head. Not the one sung the night before, but the older, harsher version in the book. It was as if the river itself had chosen to keep the original, while the human voice sought only to soften it. I wondered, not without unease, whether Tregarron's last moments had echoed the harsher refrain. The investigation, if that is what we must call it, began not with certainty, but with the faint outlines of 4 lives intersecting at oblique and uncomfortable angles. Each had known Tregarron, each had reason to resent him, and each presented a face to the world more polished than the thoughts behind it. Oxford, in this as in so much else, provides a perfect theatre for duplicity. First was Dr. Margaret Felden, a classicist whose reputation was built on scholarship so precise that it verged on cruelty. Her papers were admired, her lectures feared. She had sparred with Tregarron in public and more savagely in footnotes. Pride, I have found, is often most murderous when cloaked in erudition. I recalled seeing her once at the Sheldonian, correcting a student's pronunciation with a smile that cut deeper than any reprimand. When we spoke briefly in her college rooms, the air smelled of dust and camphor. She expressed sorrow, yes, but with the weariness of someone repeating a line rehearsed too often. And when she cited Catullus in her lament, she misquoted. Only a single word wrong, but enough. A mind like hers does not stumble without reason. Then Julian Mordaunt, a wine merchant, a former pupil of Tregarron's whose fortunes had soured. His shop lingered on the edge of insolvency, propped up by credit he could not repay. He greeted us with the charm of a man who has learned that charm is cheaper than honesty. His debts, carefully recorded in ledgers, included a sizable one to Tregarron. He laughed it off with a dismissive wave, claiming that his old tutor had understood. Yet his eyes betrayed unease when Lewis mentioned the river. The smell of cork and musk clung to him, a reminder of promises long uncorked and left to sour. Sophie Kendall came third into view, the folk singer. She had been at the pub that night, seated by the window, her voice carrying the old ballads into rooms too weary to resist them. Once, I recalled, she had been spoken of as a rising star. Now her career faltered, her audience diminished to alehouses and small gatherings. She admitted knowing Tregarron well, too well perhaps. Their conversations, she said, were about songs, history, and old societies. Yet her eyes clouded when pressed, as though a veil of shame had been drawn across a part of the story. I remembered the barmaid's words about an argument, quiet but tense. Sophie denied it, but her denial was the kind that carries its own confession. The last was Father Byrne, parish priest, keeper of secrets that never appear in confessionals. He knew the pub's history better than most, having served there as a curate when it still housed its infamous drinking clubs. His speech was measured, almost lyrical, as though every word had been weighed against scripture. He admitted Tregarron had asked questions about the past, uncomfortable ones. The priest's eyes, dark and steady, suggested knowledge he would not part with. Men of faith often believe themselves immune to worldly entanglements, but I have long since learned that piety is rarely proof against pride. 4 people, then, each intelligent, each damaged. Pride in scholarship, fear of debt, regret of a fading career, the burden of old secrets. Around them, the figure of Tregarron loomed larger in death than he had in life. It was as though drowning had rendered him more vivid, the outlines of his relationships sharper for being severed. Lewis asked me, later that evening, who I thought most likely. I told him the question was premature, but I confess I felt a tremor of certainty, even then, that the truth would not lie in the obvious ledger of debts or the public quarrels of academics. It would reside instead in the misquoted verse, the altered lyric, the details so small it risked dismissal. That is where deception flourishes best, in the trivial error that no one bothers to amend. Back in my rooms, I unfolded Tregarron's fragment once again. 3 imperfect lines. I read them aloud, slowly, listening not for what was said, but for what had been changed. Somewhere in the substitution of a word, the slipping of a rhyme, lay the reason why a man who had spent his life among papers and footnotes had ended his days in the silent embrace of the Cherwell. And though I would not admit it to Lewis, I felt that the answer, however distant, was already beginning to form in the half-lit corridors of my mind. There is a particular satisfaction in believing, however briefly, that the tangled skein of human motives has begun to unravel in one's hands. For several days, I persuaded myself that Margaret Felden was the weaver of this knot, her fingerprints disguised in the polished surfaces of scholarship and disdain. I visited her again, this time alone. Her rooms at the college were as precise as her prose, books arranged with the severity of a librarian who mistrusts sentiment. A fire burned too neatly in the grate, its flames obedient rather than lively. She offered tea in porcelain cups, thin as regret, and spoke in the measured cadence of one accustomed to domination by intellect. We spoke of Tregarron. She admitted rivalry, naturally, but with the weary air of one rehearsing a confession stripped of danger. I asked whether she had seen him in the days preceding his death. She paused long enough for the truth to slip into absence, then replied that she had not. The lie was small, but I felt it nonetheless, like a stone in the shoe. On her desk lay a draft of an article, unguarded, perhaps deliberately so. I allowed my eyes to wander over the pages. Buried among quotations was a line of Catullus, altered by a single syllable. Not an accident, not with her precision. A scholar of her caliber does not misstep. It was an insult, thinly veiled, directed at Tregarron's latest work. She flushed when she noticed my gaze, though her smile remained fixed. I apologized, though insincerely, and turned the conversation elsewhere. Later, as I walked across the quadrangle, I convinced myself of her guilt. Pride is a lethal companion, and Margaret possessed it in abundance. She had suffered the humiliation of watching Tregarron receive a grant denied to her. She had endured the indignity of his barbed comments at symposia. Was it impossible to imagine that such humiliations, gathered like pebbles, had finally weighed enough to sink him? Lewis was skeptical, of course. He listened to my exposition with the politeness of a man humoring an eccentric uncle. "All scholars quarrel," he said. "They don't usually drown each other for it." I replied that Oxford was no stranger to subtler violences, and that drowning was perhaps more poetic than stabbing. He chuckled and shook his head, but I could see that even he felt the chill of plausibility. That night, I attempted the crossword, a half-hearted affair. One clue lingered. River Lament, 6 letters. I scribbled elegy, erased it, wrote dirge. Neither fit. Yet as I stared at the empty squares, the thought returned that Margaret's Catullus misstep was deliberate. She had altered the poet not through ignorance, but through choice. What choice? To disguise, to accuse, or to warn? The question unsettled my sleep. The following day, Lewis returned with her alibi, obtained through dull but necessary legwork. Margaret had been dining with a colleague at the Randolph that evening, a colleague whose memory of the menu was as detailed as any affidavit. It was tedious but convincing. She could not have walked the towpath, could not have pressed Tregarron into the river. When I confronted her with this, she only raised her eyebrows, the faintest smile tugging at her mouth. "It seems, Inspector, that your imagination has outpaced your evidence." Her tone was not unkind, but it cut nonetheless. I murmured something about routine, about following threads, and left her to her ordered books and obedient fire. I walked away chastened, irritated less by my mistake than by my eagerness to believe in it. I had been seduced by the neatness of the theory, the elegance of a scholar's pride turned deadly. But elegance, I should have remembered, is rarely the measure of truth. Back in my rooms, I poured a whiskey and stared once more at Tregarron's fragment of verse. Imperfect rhyme, misplaced syllable. Margaret's misquotation echoed it, yet her hands were clean. I realized, with something approaching despair, that I had been misled by my own appetite for symmetry. Life, like poetry, rarely rhymes when one expects it to. The Bodleian has always struck me as a mausoleum more than a library. The smell of paper and polish, the hush that smothers even the coughs of scholars. It is a place where words go to await resurrection. I had asked for Dr. Tregarran's correspondence, a small bundle of letters tied with a string so thin it threatened to dissolve at my touch. The assistant who handed them over looked faintly apologetic, as though letters were poor nourishment compared with the feast of folios around us. I carried the bundle to a desk beneath one of the leaded windows. Rain darkened the glass, turning the light a watery grey. I untied the string with the patience of a man unwrapping a gift he already suspects he will not enjoy. Inside, the handwriting of Sophie Kendall bloomed across the pages. The letters were uneven in tone, some affectionate, almost playful, others heavy with reproach. She wrote of songs half remembered, of evenings in pubs when the air was thick with verses and regret. She asked Tregarran to stop picking at old scabs, an image that lingered unpleasantly. In one letter, she accused him of threatening to reveal something. What, she did not specify. The ink had blurred, as though her pen had paused too long or her hand had trembled. I read them twice. They told me little I could use, but much I could feel. The weight of dependence, the edge of shame, the kind of intimacy that curdles rather than deepens. The final letter ended abruptly. If you sing that verse again, I will not forgive you. I folded it carefully and slipped it back into the bundle, noting the date. 3 days before his death. Lewis telephoned as I left the Bodleian. His voice carried the satisfaction of a man who has turned over a stone and found something worth keeping. He had examined Julian Mordaunt's books, ledgers fat with debt, thin with credit. Among them, repeated entries in Tregarran's name, each larger than the last. The historian had lent him money, or perhaps demanded it back. Either way, the sums were not trivial. I met Lewis in the office and studied the figures. They told their own story, a shop in decline, a merchant clinging to appearance with both hands. Julian's charm, I recalled, had the brittle edge of desperation. I asked Lewis whether he had confronted him. "Not yet, sir. Thought you'd prefer to take the pleasure yourself." We went together that afternoon. The shop smelled of cork and damp wood. Julian greeted us with forced cheer, offering a glass of claret he could ill afford to pour. When I mentioned the debts, his face flickered, then settled into a smile too wide to be convincing. "Old tutors must be helped now and then, Inspector. Alan knew I was good for it. We had an understanding." I let him talk. He spoke of vintages, of the fickle loyalty of customers, of the cruelty of banks. Yet behind each phrase, I heard the crack in the facade. When I asked where he had been on the night of Tregarran's death, he produced an answer too ready. In London, dealing with a supplier. Receipts available, if required. Lewis looked at me afterwards, as if to ask whether we had found our culprit. I shook my head. Debts are motive enough for anger, sometimes even violence, but they rarely inspire the peculiar poetry of drowning. Money kills in blunt ways, knives, bludgeons, sudden vanishings. This death carried the echo of a song. Back in my rooms that evening, I spread the letters and the ledger pages side by side. Words of reproach, numbers of despair. Both told of a man who had pressed too hard, demanded too much. Yet I could not rid myself of the thought that neither Sophie nor Julian had the quality of silence about them. Tregarran's end had been wrapped in silence, as if rehearsed by the river itself. I poured a whiskey and turned again to the crossword. A clue awaited. Unpaid account, 5 letters. I wrote DEBT, then erased it. The better answer, I suspected, was DUE. A word smaller, sharper, less forgiving, like the truth itself, waiting just beyond the margin of evidence. It is an easy seduction, the lure of a theory that fits too neatly. For a brief span, I allowed myself to believe Julian Mordaunt was the answer to Tregarran's drowning. The unpaid debts, the uneasy charm, the ledger written in despair rather than ink. It had the symmetry of a solution, and symmetry is a dangerous narcotic. We called upon him again. Lewis, dutiful as ever, recited the figures, the precise sums owed, the dates of overdue payments. Mordaunt smiled at first, then wilted, his charm evaporating like the bouquet of cheap wine left too long uncorked. He protested that Tregarron had understood that their bond went beyond money. But as he spoke, I noticed his hand, resting on the counter, trembling slightly against the polished wood. Guilt, perhaps, or merely the tremor of a man accustomed to balancing too many lies. Later that afternoon, a witness appeared in the shape of a boatman who had moored near the Cherwell the night of the death. He claimed he had seen a figure resembling Mordaunt on the towpath, standing not far from where Tregarron's body would be found. The details seemed to harden suspicion into certainty. Lewis looked at me with the expectation of a case nearly closed. I tried to feel the same conviction, but unease lingered. I walked the river path myself, letting the mud cling to my shoes. The footprints from that night were long gone, erased by weather and time. Still, I could imagine Mordaunt there, his debts pressing him into an act of desperation, a shove in the dark, a body sliding into water that kept its own counsel. Back at the office, Lewis examined Mordaunt's car records. He returned with the air of a man reluctantly dismantling his own case. The license plate had been photographed on the motorway to London that evening, timed too precisely for coincidence. Receipts corroborated the journey. The wine merchant had indeed been elsewhere when the river claimed its historian. A red herring, then. Yet it was not wasted effort. False paths teach one to listen more acutely, to distrust the elegance of easy conclusions. I poured myself another whiskey and unfolded the crossword. A clue caught me. False lead. 9 letters. I wrote red herring without hesitation and felt a bitter amusement at the puzzle's mockery. What unsettled me most was not Mordaunt's innocence, but the silence it left behind. His debts were tangible, his desperation plain. To remove him from the circle of guilt was to strip the case of its most obvious explanation. And I have long known that the obvious explanation, though wrong, possesses a kind of gravitational pull. It drags one's thoughts back again and again, as though repetition might make it true. That evening, I visited the Kingfisher Arms alone. The songbook still lay by the bar, though now kept behind the counter, as if the landlord feared its verses had grown too dangerous. I asked him for it and leafed once more to the drowning ballad. The final stanza glared at me with its unflinching honesty. I mouthed the words silently, comparing them with the altered version I had heard sung. The change was deliberate, not accidental. A softened line, the sharper edges blunted. Mordaunt's debts had not altered that lyric. Money might corrupt a man's conscience, but it does not compel him to rewrite a song. That act belonged to someone else, someone who understood both the words and their weight. I left the pub with the faint impression that I had been listening to the wrong voices. Guilt rarely shouts. It hums quietly in the background, like a refrain one cannot forget. Back in my rooms, I sat in silence, the crossword half completed beside me, the letters from Sophie Kendall folded on the table. A fragment of the ballad returned unbidden, the line about betrayal beside water. And I thought again of Sophie's blurred ink, of her warning to Tregarron not to sing a certain verse. Mordaunt had been convenient, almost convincing. But truth is seldom convenient, and never symmetrical. I poured the whiskey, darker than the river, and conceded that I had followed another false current. The real tide still waited, pulling me towards a deeper shore. Oxford's pubs are often more reliable historians than its libraries. Their walls preserve the ghosts of conversations, their cellars conceal the traces of generations, and their faded photographs remember what official archives prefer to forget. I found myself once again in the Kingfisher Arms, staring at such a photograph, framed and askew above the hearth. The glass was fogged with years of smoke, but I could make out a group of men and women clustered around a table, tankards raised in triumph. At the center sat Alan Tregarron, 20 years younger, his hair still dark, his face sharp with ambition, and beside him, unmistakably, though younger too, Sophie Kendall. She was laughing, her hand resting lightly on his arm. It was not their closeness alone that disturbed me. It was the expression of the others, a mixture of complicity and secrecy, the camaraderie of those bound by indulgence. The landlord tried to usher me away, muttering about old societies best forgotten. But when pressed, he admitted that the Kingfisher had once hosted a private drinking club, exclusive, notorious, its members drawn from colleges and parishes alike. Songs were their emblem, but the verses disguised other entertainments, less innocent than music. I carried this knowledge to Father Byron. He received me in his study, the air thick with incense and dust, the curtains drawn against the afternoon light. He was reluctant at first, but I reminded him that silence, too, could be a form of complicity. At last, he sighed as though lifting a burden he had long held. Yes, he had known of the club. Yes, Tregarron had been part of it, and Sophie too in her youth. And yes, there had been scandals, whispered accusations, reputations bruised but not broken. Nothing ever written, of course. Oxford is skilled at erasing its blemishes. Tregarron, it seemed, had threatened to exhume those blemishes. He had been gathering fragments, songs, inscriptions, letters, half destroyed. Perhaps he sought to publish, perhaps merely to torment. Byrne would not say. But his eyes, when I mentioned Sophie's name, betrayed pity more than anger. She had been young, drawn in by admiration and the promise of belonging. Her career had faltered soon after, though whether by choice or consequence, he did not know. When I left Byron's rooms, the rain had begun again, a thin drizzle clinging to the cobblestones. I walked slowly back to my own lodgings, the photograph vivid in my mind. Sophie's laughter, frozen in time, was not the laughter of joy. It was the brittle gaiety of someone who knows that tomorrow will demand payment for tonight's indulgence. That evening I spread the evidence before me. Sophie's letters, the ledger of debts, the fragment of verse. And now the photograph. 4 strands, none complete, each fraying at the edges. But woven together, they began to form a darker pattern. Tregarron had been a collector, not merely of facts, but of failings. He had gathered the weaknesses of others and bound them like pages in his own private archive. And when he threatened to open that archive, the past itself rose against him. Lewis telephoned to ask whether I had made progress. I told him only that the past rarely remains buried, however much earth or prayer one heaps upon it. He laughed, uncertain whether I was being profound or merely evasive. Perhaps both. Later, unable to sleep, I returned once more to the crossword. A clue lingered. Old photograph, 5 letters. I wrote relic, then hesitated, and replaced it with image. Neither satisfied. At last, I left it blank, the emptiness itself more accurate than any word. For what is a photograph but a reminder that truth can be both preserved and distorted? I poured a final whiskey and thought again of Sophie, her blurred ink, her altered lyric, her laughter in that photograph. It was no longer enough to wonder whether she had argued with Tregarron in the pub. The more pressing question was what she feared he might reveal. The river had claimed Tregarron's body, but the real current was dragging me backwards, into shadows that Oxford preferred not to acknowledge. And I knew, with a heaviness I could not shake, that the past had only begun to surface. There are nights when sleep refuses to visit, and the mind turns traitor, replaying fragments with the cruelty of repetition. That evening, I sat in my rooms, the rain tapping faintly at the window, and allowed the verses of that infernal ballad to coil themselves once more around my thoughts. The singer at the pub had delivered it badly, but even poor delivery cannot erase the structure. Something about the refrain continued to itch at me. Not what was sung, but what was missing. I rose, fetched the battered songbook I had borrowed under the landlord's reluctant gaze, and compared its words to the version I recalled from the performance. There it was, a subtle alteration. A single line in the final verse had been changed. The original spoke without apology of betrayal by water, of a lover pushed beneath the river's surface, abandoned to silence. The version Sophie sang had softened it, turning betrayal into departure, drowning into absence. A less brutal choice, almost tender but false to the source. I read the two versions again and again, whispering them aloud, hearing the discord. Why alter a song unless one feared its truth? Why blunt the cruelty unless cruelty itself were implicated? Songs do not change themselves. They are changed by those who carry them. The realization struck not with triumph, but with weariness. I thought back to Sophie's letters, her reproachful lines, her blurred ink, her plea that Tregarron refrain from singing a certain verse. It was the same verse she had altered in performance. She had tried to erase its sting, to bury the words beneath a softer melody. But the river, unlike song, accepts no edits. Lewis arrived the next morning, bearing a file of routine reports. He noticed the songbook open on my desk and asked whether I had discovered anything useful. I told him only that people often reveal more in what they misremember than in what they recall correctly. He looked puzzled, but wisely refrained from pressing. We walked once more to the Kingfisher Arms. Sophie was there, tuning her guitar in the corner, her hands steady but her eyes avoiding mine. I asked her, casually, to sing the song again. She obliged, though her voice faltered when the final verse approached. And sure enough, the line was altered, just as before, a drowning disguised as absence. I caught her gaze then, and she looked away. Later, outside, Lewis remarked that it seemed a small thing, hardly proof of anything. I agreed aloud, though inside I felt the weight of it. A misquotation is rarely small. It is the thread that unravels the garment. Back in my rooms that evening, I unfolded Tregarron's fragment once more. His 3 imperfect lines had stumbled toward rhyme but never reached it. I compared them with Sophie's altered lyric, and the kinship was unmistakable. He had written the harsher version, the original refrain, while she had fought to soften it. The argument the barmaid overheard was no quarrel about history or music. It was about truth and the right to tell it. I thought of the photograph again, her laughter brittle beside his ambition, of Burns' reluctant confession that Tregarron had threatened to exhume old scandals. And now of the altered song, its sharp edge dulled in public but cutting deeper in private. The pattern emerged with painful clarity. Tregarron had held her past in his hands, had threatened to display it, and she had tried, desperately, futilely, to erase the verse that condemned her. The crossword lay unfinished beside me. A clue remained. Change of words. 11 letters. I wrote alteration, but it seemed inadequate. The better answer was confession, though the puzzle would not allow it. I left the squares empty, preferring the silence to any solution. I poured a final whiskey, staring at the rain-darkened glass, and felt the melancholy certainty settle. Sophie Kendall was not guilty by circumstance or by accident. She was guilty because she had tried to change the song, and in so doing had betrayed the truth she wished to conceal. And yet, even then, I felt less anger than pity. For there is no harsher prison than memory, and Sophie had been its inmate long before the Cherwell claimed Tregarron. It was evening when I returned to the Kingfisher Arms, the sort of hour when the day's weariness hangs in the rafters, and the patrons drink not for cheer, but for silence. Sophie was there, as I had expected, seated near the hearth with her guitar resting against the chair. The firelight caught her face, making her look both older and younger than I remembered, the years of ambition and regret flickering like shadows across her features. I asked if we might speak. She hesitated, then gestured to the empty chair opposite. Lewis lingered discreetly at the bar, his presence a shadow more than an intrusion. I began not with accusation, but with curiosity. Why, I asked gently, did she always alter the final verse of that old ballad? She smiled faintly, a smile without conviction, and said that singers often adapt songs to their taste. But her eyes betrayed her, glancing downward, avoiding the fire. I pressed no harder than silence, and it was silence that undid her. After a moment, she spoke again, her voice quieter. "Alan wanted it sung as it was written," she murmured. "He said the truth must not be softened. I told him people cannot bear such verses. I told him they wound more than they heal." I took from my pocket the photograph, the old one from the pub wall, and placed it on the table. She stared at it as though at an old wound. "You laughed that night," I said, "but not with joy." She nodded once, then reached for her glass. "He wanted to drag it all back," she whispered. "The club, the songs, the nights we thought were harmless but were not. He wanted to write about it, to prove something. He said he would sing the verse to everyone if I did not agree, and I could not bear it." Her voice faltered. She looked into the fire as though searching for absolution. "We walked by the river," she said. He mocked me, repeating the lines, the cruel ones. I begged him to stop. He would not. He said I was nothing without those songs, that my career was already ash. And then her words broke, and for a long time there was only the crackle of the hearth. "At last," she continued, almost inaudible, "I pushed him. Just once. I did not mean—" She lifted her hands, studying them as if they belonged to someone else. "He slipped, or I slipped. The water took him so quickly. I thought he would swim. He did not." I sat back, listening not to her words, but to the spaces between them. There was no triumph in her confession, no satisfaction, only the weary resignation of someone who has carried too heavy a secret for too long. Lewis approached then, his face grave, his notepad untouched. I nodded to him. He placed a gentle hand on Sophie's shoulder, not unkindly, and she did not resist. She looked at me once more, eyes hollow, yet strangely relieved. "He would have destroyed me," she whispered. Perhaps he already had. They left together, Lewis leading her out into the rain-dark street. I remained by the fire, the photograph still on the table, the songbook heavy in my pocket. Around me, the pub continued its indifferent murmur. Glasses clinked, voices rose and fell, the ordinary life of Oxford unshaken by the drowning of a man or the despair of a woman. I ordered a whiskey and drank it slowly. The flames flickered, devouring the last of the logs, and I thought of how songs endure even when voices falter. Sophie had tried to alter the verse, but the river had sung the harsher version. When at last I stepped into the night, the rain had softened to mist. The city glistened, its spires blurred, as though ashamed of what it had witnessed. I walked home alone, hearing still the cadence of the song, unaltered, unforgiving, echoing beneath the silence of the Cherwell. The case ended not with fanfare, but with paperwork, a fate more tedious than tragic. Sophie Kendall was charged, statements were taken, and the slow machinery of law began its procession. Yet for me, resolution has never equated to peace. The morning after her arrest, I sat at my desk, the crossword unfolded before me, and found myself staring not at words, but at absence. The clue that had eluded me for days still waited. Parting words, 7 letters. Farewell, goodbye, adios. None quite fitting. At last, I wrote adieu, the letters black and final against the white squares. It felt too small, too simple for what had passed. But perhaps all endings are inadequate when measured against the complexity of lives undone. Lewis telephoned in the afternoon. His voice was steady, tinged with sympathy he tried not to reveal. He asked whether I was all right. I told him brusquely that I was, though even I could hear the hollowness. He mentioned routine matters, other cases, and pressing deadlines. I listened, gave perfunctory replies, then set the receiver down. The silence that followed was heavier than any conversation. I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window. Outside, Oxford sagged beneath another rain. The cobblestones glistened, the gutters murmured, and bicycles leaned against walls like weary sentinels. Students hurried with umbrellas, their laughter carrying faintly across the quadrangle. Life continued indifferent to the fact that one man had drowned and one woman had confessed to pushing him. I thought of Alan Tregarron, his unfinished verse, his ambition, his cruel insistence on unmasking the past. I thought of Sophie, her blurred ink, her altered lyric, her weary face when at last the truth escaped her. They had both been trapped by memory, by a song that refused to soften, and in the end, the river had been their only chorus. That night, I walked alone along the Cherwell. The water moved sluggishly, swollen by rain, carrying fragments of leaves and reflections of street lamps. I paused at the spot where Tregarron had fallen or been pushed. The mud bore no trace of struggle now, only silence. Yet I imagined again the impressions I had once seen. 2 sets of feet, steady, deliberate, waiting. Not the chaos of accident, but the stillness of decision. I lit a cigarette and let the smoke drift upward. The city behind me hummed faintly. Bells from a chapel, laughter from a pub, the faint clatter of crockery. Ahead only the river, indifferent, unhurried. I wondered whether Sophie's confession had given her release, or merely another verse to repeat endlessly in the solitude of her cell. When I returned to my rooms, the crossword still lay on the desk, half completed. I filled in a few clues absently, but my mind was elsewhere. A line from Houseman returned to me, this time correctly remembered. And malt does more than Milton can to justify God's ways to man. I smiled faintly at the irony. Drink, song, and pride. The 3 elements that had drawn Tregarron to his end, and Sophie to her ruin. I drained the last of the wine and turned off the lamp. Darkness settled. Familiar, not unfriendly. The rain pressed gently at the window, steady as breath. I thought again of the clue, parting words. Adieu. Yes, perhaps that was the only answer we ever truly have. And so the case closed, not with revelation, not with triumph, but with the echo of a song misremembered and a river that kept its silence.